And I saw my first Rangers game at the age of 4, so you could say where at least 60, almost 66 years. And probably even before that, because, you know, there's pictures of me wearing Rangers regalia when I was a year old, pajamas, and there was stuff in my room. So who knows when it started? Maybe in the womb. It was unspoken, you know, it was just that there was no question I was going to be a Rangers supporter. Like it was just never, and so he never had to convince me that here's all the reasons. He didn't sit down and say, here's a list of 5 reasons why you should support Rangers. It was just, you know, I mean, where we lived, it was in the atmosphere, it was ethereal, you know, you just, everybody was a Ranger. If you supported football, you supported Rangers, or if you did, you supported Partick Thistle, you never admitted it. You know, we had pictures of the Rangers players. I mean, this is long before you had, you know, jerseys and replica jerseys and that kind of stuff, but you did have scarves. There was lots of scarves, there was cards, there was Rangers Christmas cards, there was Rangers birthday cards, we had a couple of Rangers pennants and crests in the room, so I was surrounded by it. My brother was too, but he was never interested. My father had 11 brothers and 2 sisters, and they were all Ranger supporters. And my mother's 3 brothers were all Ranger supporters. So I mean, I think, and also the area I lived in, around Paisley Road Toll, was, you know, Rangers mad. You know, you were just aware of it constantly. All my pals at school in Glasgow, we were all Ranger supporters. And you know, our fathers would while they wouldn't always take us to the first team games, we used to go and watch the reserves play because they'd be playing alternate on Saturdays. So, you know, it was just part of the, I mean, I can't remember not being a Ranger supporter. Maybe that's the simplest way to put it. I mean, I've never been without Rangers in my life. Again, you know, I mean, they were just fanatics. I mean, they were much more fanatical than my father, as I said before. I mean, they were quite sectarian. They were, you know, dyed-in-the-wood Govan Billy boys and Orangemen, whereas my father wasn't. And yeah, I mean, you know, I always remember because, you know, they used to kick the ball around with me a lot in the backyard in my granny and granda's garden. Because they were younger than my father. They were all about 6 or 7 years younger. And so, you know, they were very supportive of me, and they, you know, if my father couldn't take me to a match, they'd take me. And the war actually changed my father quite dramatically. He became a lot less religious. In fact, he rarely went to church in Scotland. My mum used to take me every week. But the horrors of the war, and I think seeing concentration camp, actually meant that he was a Ranger supporter, but he wasn't sectarian. He did not have an intense dislike of Catholicism. And I think that was probably the most important thing that he passed on to me. In his youth, he went to the games all the time. Clearly, when he was in the army in the 30s, he didn't get to go to that many games. He would only get to see them if he was home on leave. But after the war, when he came home, he went to the matches every Saturday. I mean, I do remember my father, you know, as the main Rangers influence, but obviously he got it from his father. And so, yes, standing behind my father was my grandfather, and you know, my uncles also. In fact, my uncles were more fanatical than my father. I mean, they were quite sectarian, that I remember. I mean, these things go back for years. Like my granddad, he would tell stories about going to Rangers matches in the 1890s. You know, so this was not. I mean, so in the family, this is not a come hither thing. Like it was a very serious, heavy-duty, you know, linear phenomenon. My grandfather was a rather somewhat dour which is a shock for a Scot, to be sure. And he was a milkman. I remember, I can still remember him taking me for a ride in his milk cart. And he died just before we came to Canada. So he had great stories. He was originally from the Highlands, and then he came down to Glasgow, and he became a milkman. The only thing I remember my grandfather talking about was the huge crowds, like going to matches with 100,000 people, which in these days of all Cedar Stadium is hard to believe. And when you look at the pictures of those days, when you see them all packed in, and people spilling over onto the grounds, it's quite mind-boggling. It's a historical link between me and my grandparents and my father, my uncles, and my current cousins and that who are in Glasgow to this day, who still support Rangers. So at one level is this kind of historical link. I like the tradition of the club. It's been a successful club. It stood and represented the Glasgow Protestant working class, and I have a strong identification. With that. And also, it's partly its blood, but it's also partly just I like communal solidarity. And there's lots of solidarity amongst Ranger supporters. It's something that strangers, you may not know them in your everyday life, but if you're a Ranger supporter, you meet another Ranger supporter, you bond. There's a link there. Which is incredibly personal. We live in, I think, a really personal world. And being a football supporter is a chance. When you go to games, either live or in television, you're with a bunch of people that you all share a common goal. I still remember, I've got memories from when I was about 4. I still remember walking along Paisley Road to go to Ibrox. I remember that. There's another picture of me at Ibrox from 1950 with my autograph book waiting for the players to come out to get autographs. My mother kept them for years, and my plan is just to give them to my daughter at some point. I came to Canada when I was 10 in 1954. Was not happy about coming to Canada because it meant that I wouldn't be able to support Rangers, and it was frustrating in those years because you had to rely on newspapers, and the newspapers would come by mail about 3 weeks later, and everything had passed you by, and you weren't up to date. You'd hear the scores on a Saturday afternoon on this Scottish radio program, but it was very little detail. Well, it was a struggle initially. It was a huge struggle because it was just difficult to get information. You relied on letters, then you relied on weeks-old newspapers because it wasn't that easy to call. Long-distance calling in those days was very expensive, and you had to set it up in advance. And the other difficulty was that people in Glasgow not a lot of them had phones. Like, we didn't have a phone when I lived in Glasgow. It was like Valhalla when we came here. There was no more rationing. You could get all the butter you wanted. You could get all the meat you wanted. And you had a telephone. It was like being transported into paradise. So it was hard. It was very hard. You'd go back on trips and, you'd sort of... my aunt would send me out the Rangers diary every year, and she'd send me out a calendar. I'd always get a Rangers birthday card. But it was difficult. But at the same time, in some ways, because you had known it, it was enough to keep you going until you then in the late 80s, early 90s, when you began getting all the games. And then it changed quite dramatically because you were watching the game And I mean, this is the beautiful thing, is you're actually watching the game at the same time the people in the stadium are. And so there is this, I think, a real identity. You can catch up the songs that the crowd are singing. You see the crowd getting on to certain players, getting on to the referee, and you get involved in the moment with them also. I mean, you also feel the same thing. So it's almost like being there. And in fact, in some ways, you're getting a better view than being there. Perks? Well, the perks are that, for me, it's a rebirth of my continuity with my relatives, with the team, with all my relatives who supported Rangers, and so there is the perk is now being able to see them all the time. I mean, we see more games than they do in Glasgow. But some of my memories, really great memories, are when you're traveling. And somebody sees you wearing a Rangers hat and comes up and introduces themselves and says, and sometimes they're Scots or they're expat, but other times there are people who, either their team had played Rangers at some point, and so you sort of realize the international dimension to soccer, which I think is quite unique amongst sports. Winning the European Cup, Winners' Cup in 1972 in Barcelona and actually being there. It was just the communal joy of being there, being away from Glasgow, supporting your team, and having them win. It was just a great, great experience. You bonded with everybody. Everybody was your friend. It was a great experience. The worst would be the bankruptcy. I mean, that was just, I still haven't quite figured it out. Even what's going on now, I'm not even sure we're out of the woods yet, because the financial clarity is almost non-existent. There's money going out, but we know there's money coming in, but we're not sure exactly where it is going out. And so that was very depressing, being forced to go down to the what was then the 4th division. Well, I think they've had a tremendous influence on me. I mean, in a whole bunch of ways. Partly, I've always played. I mean, I've played and coached football, and I think that what I learned being a supporter and watching Rangers play, the importance of getting behind the team, the importance of solidarity. I'm a huge believer in that, and both, playing football, coaching football, but also in life. I don't believe in naked individualism. I believe in the collective. When I coach soccer, my view always is that the team's only as good as its weakest player. The team is what's really important. It's not individuals, and that's also transferred into my politics. To be blunt, I'm a left winger. I'm a Marxist, and I believe in the collective. And soccer reinforces that. And maybe it's because I'm also trained as a historian. I sort of believe in that there are links between the past and the present and the future. I've influenced my daughter to be a football supporter. She was a Rangers supporter for a while, when she was probably from about 4 until she was 13. And then we were in Glasgow and in Spain while Euro 96 was on. And she used to come to Rangers games with me every Saturday morning at the Bow and Arrow pub up at Yonge and Davisville. And but when we went to Glasgow, she was watching Euro and she was shocked. She was watching England playing, and she was watching the game, and England lost on penalty kicks, famous Gareth Southgate's blunder. And she was shocked at how happy Scottish supporters were. They were out in the streets applauding and jumping up and down. So it taught her a lot about nationalism. So I have an influence on her, both in her politics and her seeing the important relationship between nationalism and soccer. And, you know, she did this for both her MA and her PhD. And she is a diehard Liverpool supporter to this day. She goes to the games, and she went, when she was living in Montreal, she went to the Liverpool games there. And she goes every week to watch Liverpool play in Minneapolis, where she's living now. Mostly I shared the experience of going to matches with my father, and her, you know, and her, and my uncles. The experience and the joy of Barcelona in 1972. You know, so those are the kind of things that I shared with her. You know, the importance of getting behind your team and supporting them. I became a Ranger supporter through transmission from my grandfather to my father, and I learned as a football player from a whole variety of coaches, and they transmitted certain things to me, and I went through a process of selection, you know, rejecting some, embracing others, and I sort of see myself passing that on. The importance of teamwork, the importance of always giving players support, not leaving players on their own. Ball possession. I always tell them, you know, the other team can't score if we've got the ball. And therefore, you know, no wild kicks of the ball, no rash clearances. Try to play football at all times. It's a beautiful game. It's been very interesting, very rewarding. You know, I played up until I was into my early 50s. And then I began doing a lot of coaching. And most of my coaching in the last few years has actually been coaching young girls and women, which has actually been probably the most rewarding of all, because they actually understand the concept of team play, I think, much better than the boys that I used to coach in North Toronto and out in Mississauga, who a lot of them are, you know, a tendency for glory hogs. And with women, the young women I coach, it's all about the team, and they have a concept of team play much better, and it's what I've always took out of soccer. I always saw soccer as being a team. I never really was the big one for individual stars. It was always for me movement and fluidity and sort of, you know, everybody covering up for each other and playing alongside each other, being encouraging. So I think that, you know, it has had a big influence on how I approach life. When you're so high, when you fall from the sky, you won't break. So come down from the clouds, come down.